Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to New Books in Performing Arts, a podcast from the New Books Network. My name is Andy Boyd. My guest today on the program is John Szwed, author of the book Cosmic Scholar, The Life and Times of Harry Smith, the filmmaker, folklorist, and mystic who transformed American art. John, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So I, like probably most people who know about Harry Smith, knew him as the editor of the Anthology of American Folk Music, which is, in my opinion, the greatest compilation album ever released. But I didn't really know anything about the person behind that name, which turns out to be quite an extraordinary life story. Could you just give us a brief sense of who Harry Smith was?
Well, that's the toughest question of all. As background, you could think of this that, let's see, how far back could we go? When Harry died at the memorial service they had for him, there were people there who were not only surprised at some of the people who showed up, but they were wondering why they were there, and in an annoyed sort of way. I mean, what's this filmmaker? Why are these filmmakers here, or this psychiatrist, or whatever? And I thought at first when I heard about that, well, these things happen. But then I found out that when he first passed, the people closest to him got together with Chelsea to try to figure out what to do with his stuff and how to continue his legacy. And they were annoyed that some of the people were there. And then I found out that when the Getty put on a 2-day symposium, bringing in lots of people, the same thing happened again. They were really annoyed. So two things to come from that is how narrow we all are, I guess. And the other is how secretive Harry was. There seems to be, I resisted saying this at first, but it looks like you can't help but say that he was trying to keep these people apart from each other, and for strange reason. What are the people? Well, let's see. Starting back from his earliest days, he was a child prodigy who, to put it mildly, who was deep into Native American culture, at least where he was raised on the northwest coast of Washington State, and he was also interested in classical music early on, and then discovered folk music by accident when he actually found some records being thrown out, and he was shocked by what they sounded like, and he moved into that kind of thing. Then he went to college to study anthropology. He dropped out after the war was going on. He dropped out after a few terms, went to Berkeley, and he continued collecting records. By now he had about 20,078 RPMs, it seems like, in various places. And at this point, he resorted back to something he was trained in, which was painting and drawing. He'd taken for years, I guess, as a kid, taken courses from a WPA teacher who was quite good, and he said over 1,000 drawings and paintings, most of which, all of which have been lost. So now he was a painter and a kind of collector and anthropology person and so forth. But he was drifting into surrealism at Berkeley. And then his paintings started to take on a new kind of shape. He turned to filmmaking, which he had never done per se, making him a filmmaker. And from there on, it spins out, collecting everything in sight. I'm trying to think of a nice way to put this.
That problem seems to come up for you in the book often, trying to find a nice way to put this. I mean, one of the questions that I kept kind of asking myself reading your book was like, this is not like a very formal academic question, but like, is this guy for real? Like, is he, and I don't really know what I mean by that, but other than just like, I don't know, he kind of seems at times like a charlatan. At other times, he seems like a complete genius, and he left behind at least a few works that have stood the test of time and are likely to continue to do so. But some of the ideas he gets up to, you think, did he even believe what he was saying?
Well, two
I
thoughts.
mean, you reproduce some of his lectures late in life that he gave at the school in Colorado that was founded in Jack Kerouac's memory, and it's like, it's this weird mix of absolute brilliance and kind of total incoherence. I mean, that must have been hard for a biographer.
Two thoughts there. One is Peter Stamfel's piece called "His Tapes Roll On," and one of the lines is, he was conned by a few people and conned a few conned a few others. Um, Another way to look at it is that, well, he was in New York for 10 years before anyone knew what he. That's not quite right. He was in New York for 10 years before there was any mention of him in any medium that would we could find evidence of him until about 1964. The Village Voice, Jonas Mekas began his piece by saying, "Does Harry Smith even exist?" So back to your question, then he says it's possible that he's already left the planet, which made me think of Sun Ra, who had written about it before. You know, both these people seem to be cosmic in some way or another. So yeah, what is he? I mean, he you know, you use the terms autodidact and poly this and that and genius and then you can also add in mad if you want to, or half mad, as people would use on him. He could fit all kinds of categories. It's for sure that he had, as the late John Cohen said, he had a mind like a computer, and he could, you know, snap up items faster than you could think of them. So fast that he seemed to be talking faster than he could think. Sorry, thinking faster than he could talk. And then
Sometimes both.
someone asked and said something about that, and he said, "Well, he didn't exactly say that he was talking, you know." Well, he put it this way: that there was no language which would fit what he had to say. You know? And in a sense, I suppose that's true.
Yeah. I almost imagine, like a group of people talking about Harry Smith, and someone comes up and says, "Are you talking about Harry Smith, the filmmaker?" And they say, "Oh, no, we're talking about Harry Smith, the painter." And then somebody else says, "Oh, I thought you were talking about Harry Smith, the anthropologist." And somebody else says, "Oh, I thought you were talking about Harry Smith, the Kabbalistic mystic." And they only later find out that they're actually all talking about the same guy. I think that's partially helped by having such a generic name, but also just the incredible range of interests that this person had. I mean, it's really remarkable, all the different areas he was able to not only dabble in, but make significant contributions in.
Yeah, and it took me a while to figure out that you immediately start doubting a person like this, as I did Sun Ra, but you find that you do this at your own risk, just at the point where you think, "Aha, this is bull, this is whatever," and then suddenly you realize you've been misunderstanding what they were saying, and it happened again and again with Harry, and he was running faster than you were, and he had a habit, by the way, of this was noted by someone who had interviewed him at great length, but not written about it much, that he would start something, stop it, and go to something else. Well, okay, people do that. But then hours or even days later, he would start where he left off the previous time. And it's cut up. It's sort of a cut up phenomenon. It's a one person. Um, I don't want to be careful with the word surrealism right now. By the way, the word surrealism is interesting here because the people he started out with, I mean, talking about being 15 years old and going to Native American reservations up in the coast, and they were on the northwest coast. There every so many miles, and lots of them, small groups. He ingratiated himself with the elders to the point that they were not only allowing him to hang out, but they were letting him in on things which were forbidden to other people. In fact, forbidden to the point that the U.S. had laws against certain kinds of rituals. It kind of enforced acculturation, and you shouldn't be doing this or that. That was done away with in the 50s, and in Canada only did away with theirs in the 60s. So Harry was seeing things that were technically illegal. And nothing that would shock you. It's just they didn't want,
Right.
they didn't want that around. So he starts out like this with incredible reading habits, reading everything he could find in the libraries in the two towns he lived in, and apparently remembering enormous amounts of them. But then every now and then something would really stun me about him. He gave an interview with a man who had a newsletter in Australia, a film newsletter, and he wanted to talk to Harry about film, and Harry wanted to talk about Australian anthropology. Now, having studied anthropology, I knew that there was hardly anyone in the U.S. who knew anything about that, more than one or two people here and there who worked in Australia. And it's a distinct crowd of people and a distinct culture. So Harry proceeds in this interview, it was published, to rattle off all the key names in the history of anthropology and pre-anthropology in Australia, quoting at length from them. And I'm thinking, my God, you have two choices here. He knew all this stuff before and still had it in his memory, or the night before he started reading this stuff and he still was doing it. No, but he's not faking. He really knew it. Every now and then he'd start quoting from a piece of poetry gathered by so-and-so and so on. It's in that sense, there's something absolutely phenomenal and inhuman about this kind of person.
All right. And I guess I have a similar question about the anthropological research you did as a teenager in Washington State. From your perspective as an anthropologist, I mean, he was at that point, an amateur. He was untrained formally in anthropology. How kind of useful or credible was that work that he did, in his teenage years?
Well, I can quote from a teacher he had, who I also had at one point, Melville Jacobs. He was quoted in the press as saying, when Harry was still in high school, that he was much more advanced than the graduate students he knew and many faculty members. Now, that's because Harry had gone to see him and asked him to teach him to do things like how do you write an international phonetic code so that you get into serious hardcore linguistics. And Harry was then beginning to make word lists of two languages and wanting to use more than two different languages on the West Coast, and he was going to do them comparatively. Now, there's several things to say about that. One is these languages were on the decline, and you really had to work to get older people to work with you, and they weren't always that cooperative. And it meant sitting with people for hours and hours and days where you say, what does that mean? And the problem with phonetic stuff is that you may not hear it. If it's not in your system of sounds, it may just pass off as some, clearing your throat or whatever. So at 15, 16, 17, he was doing this really advanced work in linguistics. And at the same point, he was trying to work out a system of how you could notate dance. And dance notation is notoriously lacking. The ballet people are probably the further along on that. They're not that far along. So Harry was inventing his own system how you could transcribe the dance steps. Otherwise, you'd have to film them, and of course, he had no film or money to spend on that kind of thing. Anyway, that left me with a feeling of why in the world were they doing this? I mean, nowadays, they kick you off the reservation if they show you with a notebook. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but they're much more restrictive, and they think the current people from those various groups can't understand why this happened. I don't like to speculate. My best guess, though, would be that, and at a time when modern media, like not TV yet, but film and so forth, were coming in recordings, their own people were drifting away from some of the basics, and particularly the younger people. And that here comes this white kid who's dying to know all these things and learning them and learning the languages. There's at least a few cases where this happened with anthropologists who did just that. At 12 years old, they were going to powwows representing Indian groups. So it's not impossible.
So they kind of saw him as a way to preserve their culture from the kind of influences of encroaching modernism, kind of.
Yeah, and many years later, when he went to Florida and visited the Seminoles in the Everglades, I talked to a fellow who went with him, a student who was hanging out with him, and I said, "How'd that go?" And he said, "Well, he was welcomed by the older people. But the younger people ignored him." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because they were listening to Dylan's Blonde on Blonde at that time, and they'd grown their hair long and had, they were living, they had battery-driven record players. They thought Harry was coming, from the old world."
Did Harry tell them that he knew Bob Dylan, and
Well, actually,
would that have impressed them?
he was obsessed by Blonde on Blonde. In fact, he would sometimes sing parts of it, for people. We can come to that, but to jump ahead, he he was never that fond of Dylan's electrical records, but he wasn't it wasn't a problem, and he thought, I think he had some kind of deep connection with him. My point being, where I'm coming to, is that he resisted seeing him even when Dylan came to visit where he was staying, and he said, I don't want to. I'm sleeping. Leave me alone. He ducked in at other times, so I was never able to explain that. Someone who knew him at the time said that he thought that Harry thought that they had this spiritual connection that might be messed up if they actually met each other. It's possible.
I completely understand that. I've resisted reaching out to authors' publicists if I especially like their work, because I feel like actually interviewing them might kind of break the mystique.
Yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah. You also wrote a book about Alan Lomax, who some people believed Harry Smith was a pseudonym for Alan Lomax. Not true, of course, but um, and you write that the differences in their approaches to folk music and kind of ethnography in general are often overstated. So, kind of, what were the differences between them, and what were the similarities between how they approached kind of recording and interfacing with these different music cultures around the world?
Yes, you're right. The writing about Lomax, particularly when he passed away, and then when Harry came up in the context, would be to say that Alan was the purist and Harry was the impurist, and Harry was the good guy because he knew that the commercial recordings were valuable and should be understood for what they were, even pop versions of stuff, and where Lomax was. But that was exactly wrong in two fronts. One is they knew each other, both respected each other enormously, and that Harry had done field recordings. They're in the Smithsonian, but no one seems to want to bring them out, of sort of Appalachian material, varieties of Native American songs and so on. He had done this same kind of thing, and let's face it, he was the producer of the first Fugs record. He recorded Ginsberg's music, so he was also interested in pop as well. Some of his taste always threw me, like he loved Donna Summers. I don't know what to make of that. And um, I was telling everybody to go see him. He was crazy about reggae. Um, so anyway, those kind of polarities are wrong. I can see why people like to write in that kind of fashion, but the real difference, if I had to talk about it, would be that Lomax was writing about how things were on their way out, or the old things were on their way out, and you had to move fast, but also you had to protect them in some way, which he certainly did and worked on a revival of it. Harry would have said the same thing, only he thought this was the natural course of things. And in some places, he'd be talking about how Elvis Presley must be popular in China by now, which I'm sure he was in some way or another.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Levi Strauss's discussion of entropy, the idea that kind of, as we become more interconnected, cultural differences are inevitably going to die away, but that doesn't mean that we can stop the process of, globalization or cosmopolitanization that's unleashed by the modern world. That's just sort of a consequence of the modern world, is that, these folk cultures are kind of on their way out. I mean, and there's a kind of elegiac quality to that, but it can also just be a sort of frank understanding that that's the way of cultural change.
Yeah, and things are on their way out always. I mean, that's the factor about it. On the other hand, they also come back in ways, and sometimes people don't even recognize because they didn't know the original. Um, History of rock is like that, I think, in many ways. Yeah. What to say about that? Harry is also misread on the purpose of the anthology. They'll say things like he's the first person to not identify the race of the performers, which is simply wrong. The record companies used to do used to try to pass people off one way or the other. There were several lawsuits where people sued to get off the other label. But also on Folkways Records, which he ended up on, they had done a number of them where they didn't even identify where the country was for some people, and for reasons that it was similar to Harry's reasons, which are in his notes, but despite of all the writings about him, they ignore the part where he talks about just this, that the musics are interpenetrating each other to a degree that you can't always tell who's who. And he was reveling in that fact, not bemoaning it.
Right. Even I mean, and the vast majority, I think, all but one or two tracks in the anthology are from the American South, where we've been led to believe that segregation was this iron wall, but you can tell in the music that at least among working class people, there was always a degree of cultural back and forth that shows up. I mean, you cite the example of people thinking that Mississippi John Hurt was like some upcountry white hillbilly singer. And of course, he's, one of the great African American songwriters of all time.
Yeah, and I was, from early childhood, I was raised in Birmingham, Alabama, and that's the deepest memories I have of what radio was like. There was music on there I'd never heard before, and probably never heard again. An enormous number of gospel quartets and things of that order, but also some people like Hank Williams, who was singing in several different zones, if you want to, as he's doing kind of rock records when he talks about hey, good looking, that kind of thing. He's also doing Cajun music. The point being that radio was totally integrated. You couldn't escape it. Now, I thought that was specific to the South, but I was just reading a book where someone is talking about Chicago in the 50s, and he says, I heard more Serbian, Italian, and I forget what else, and Polish music than I did rock, rhythm and blues and jazz and so on. They were just filled with it. You grew up with it. I was suddenly surprised. I'm thinking, well, this is the way radio was, and they also had, so even illegally, they were broadcasting very often from Mexico or the border, so they could beat the laws and then pump the stations up across the country. So you're likely to have heard incredible music as if you were on a shortwave radio.
And some of this would not have been records. It would have been people performing live in the studio, right? Wasn't that quite a bit of a radio back then?
Absolutely, particularly in the South. That stuff has not been paid attention to. I think Mike Seeger recorded a lot of it, and he put a little bit out, but it's kind of fascinating. But then, to me, the really least known thing is how very often the DJs who were playing, say, black music were themselves white. And I have a few tapes lying around where people who would, they were actors or whatever, somehow found their way into the South. And you're thinking, well, people didn't know the difference and whatever, it was radio. But one of these guys, Hoss Allen, when he passed, there were 3,000 some people at his funeral, and they were all African American.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me of that the Ralph Ellison line in Invisible Man that I'm going to butcher, but something like, who knows, but on the lower frequencies, I speak for you, right? Yeah.
Also, I was thinking if it's not the first record, it was certainly the first hit of Chuck Berry's was Maybelline, and Maybelline is nothing but a slightly changed version of Bob Wills' Ida Red. And when I discovered that, I thought, well, this is interesting. He's using, kind of literally what they used to call country and Western, using the Western music as a basis for rock and roll. But when I found out that even before this, a bebop band in Philadelphia had recorded Ida Red, it was in the air.
You've written extensively on jazz music, and that was another of Smith's interests. You write quite a bit about Harry Smith's idea of trying to transpose bebop solos into painting, and not in a sort of impressionistic sense of I was listening to this album while I was painting, but literally each brushstroke corresponds to a note in the solo or in the composition. Could you write a little bit about that project, or could you talk a little bit about that project and what he was up to in that, and I don't know. Can these paintings be read as almost like sheet music, or is it more abstract than that?
Well, to back up a second, he'd gotten shocked into listening to country music and so forth, and was certainly picking that up when he was getting all of his records. That he was the records that he was getting were often thrown out during the war. It's another story itself, but that was what he was doing. But then when I found out that a number of these people that he had on his anthology were alive, and they were appearing at the Friends of Old Time Music in the village. I checked with John Cohen, who was the co-founder of it, and he said Harry never went to him. I said he never went to the things that he was lionized. He said no, he was going to jazz clubs. He'd moved
Wow.
on. Now that's to back up. In 1946, let's say 47, when came down to Berkeley from Seattle, bebop had reached the West Coast a little later, but not much later than it had on the East Coast. And when I started exploring that a bit, I found out that the people who responded to it, that you could categorize as people, most frequently were artists and filmmakers, which stunned me. And I'm thinking, what in the devil? So some early experimental films and art films used jazz records as background, even as far as New Zealand, where there were several people doing this kind of thing. Then Harry's best friend, who was the painter, without going into names, one of his best friends said of that was that bebop was simply the most radical thing going, and that arts people all thought we got to be part of this because it's running ahead of us. It's like abstract expressionism is already there in this stuff. And in fact, a lot of painters who didn't really try to paint the music sometimes put the titles onto it. Occasionally, someone would try to do it, but in a kind of subtle way, like painting one painting over top of another, suggesting bebop's practice of putting one melody on top of another melody. And so you could either listen to knowing that they were both going at the same time or not listen to it that way. So it was this kind of, and bebop is objected to by all kinds of people. This is why I find it kind of fascinating. The jazz people hated it by and large.
Right.
They belittled the people. Louis Armstrong made a record, a very funny record, mocking it, called the Boppin' Poof song, built on the Whiffin' Poof song. The Russians even hated it. They said it's more American decadence, and we don't need that. So, other people were saying it sounds like Chinese music, and what it was extremely abstract in terms of the existing pop or light classical music, because it had lots of stop and go, lots of non-repeated passages. It could go on, but it was breaking rules like crazy, and by people who were presenting themselves as artists, not just as pop people, but somehow, we're into a new zone. Well, Harry somehow got into that. He skipped over entirely the rhythm and blues, which I found fascinating. He must have thought it was already backward, and it was just as when it was reaching the public in the mid '40s, and hits like which are no longer remembered, like "Open the Door, Richard," um, which everybody knew at the time. Now totally forgotten, but everybody knew it at the time, and Harry's not paying attention to it. He's going into this other stuff. So what he did in his paintings was to try to get that complexity across. But if he had done that just by doing schematics or something, it would have been, I don't know, repetitive, I think. But what he did was use different forms for this, Kabbalah here, some kind of geometrics there. So each one of these representations he did of a recording have a form which is different from another. Now, he claimed that every brush stroke, every touch of the brush to the canvas was a chord, a note, a rhythm, whatever. And he apparently, we only have memories of people who saw this. He would play the record, show you the painting, and then with a ruler or something, point to where it was in it and trail it around. I've got a rough drawing of this that someone did, and I could see how it worked. It was a Dizzy Gillespie recording of "Lover Come Back to Me." He was particularly fond of Gillespie, for two reasons, I think. One, because Gillespie was using Latin, particularly Cuban material, mixed in with bebop, which made it all the more complex rhythmically, but also because he had used marijuana for the first time at a Dizzy Gillespie performance, and he said his whole life was changed. That and a Bessie Smith recording, which I can't quite relate to in that way, but and he said he saw these explosions of colors and so forth. So Harry trying to represent this, and you can imagine with a single 78 record, which you have to keep stopping and going, how long it would take to just even transcribe the damn thing. You'd have to spend, weeks at it possibly. He was spending years, and so he never did that many, and they were all either mostly Gillespie, a couple Charlie Parker things, and a couple Perez Prado recordings have disappeared. So can you play them? That's a good question, and a musician asked me about that, and I said, well, if you understood what that dot came to be or is coming from, and you could separate it, basically understand the language that he's working with, yes. And then I said, when someone asked me about this the first time, I said, but I imagine it would still be full of mistakes, to which this musician said, so are the normal music transcriptions. Even Monk's own transcriptions of Thelonious Monk's transcriptions of his own work contain some what people would not call errors, but they're not the same. Something's mixed in there.
And it seems like, especially with bebop, I mean, so much of it is the tone. I mean, when you talk about the great saxophone players of the 50s and 60s, a lot of what you're talking about is tone, timbre. It's not the notes they're playing. It's not the rhythms. It's the sound that they're getting out of those notes and rhythms. So, those are things that are notoriously hard to capture in traditional music notation. Do you think partially he was trying to kind of do what traditional music notation was bad at doing in that sense?
It's a nice thought. Thinking someone like Charlie Parker, people at the time who were close to that music, one of the things that affected him was that he was stressing notes where nobody would stress notes, and doing them in ways that were unpredictable. And on the same recording, there was the second time it came up, it wasn't like that. Or to give a shifting example to Dizzy Gillespie's recording of the record Anthropology, appropriately, which, by the way, I used to have on my message machine at Yale, freak people out, so finally took it away. Anthropology begins every phrase on a different beat. Now, that's really conscious, compositional thinking. And it also throws everything into a cocked hat if you're listening to it and say, whoa, where did that come from? And it didn't repeat in the ways other things did. So it's fresh material kept flying at you. This all on a 3.5 minute record. And if we add to this that Parker, at some point, certainly at his recording of Coco, which Harry painted, he was playing 13 notes a second. And I've invited people to try to just drum on the table 13 fingertips in 1 second. I can't do it. Now try putting it in your brain, transferring it to your breath, to the reed, to the instrument, to your fingers, and out through the horn in the same speed. So even if you dislike the music, you had to say, "What in the hell?"
Right. I mean, the bebop generation really saw themselves as, as inheritors of modernism, right? I mean, I think of Charlie Parker playing a piece of, I think it was the Firebird Suite when he saw Stravinsky at one of the clubs.
Yeah.
I mean, these were very conscious, composers and formal artists in that sense.
Yeah, and there's a sort of unwritten history of younger avant-garde, so-called composers of the time who wanted to know more about it. Slipping my mind at the moment, I'll think of who it was in a second. One example, one composer hired a group of musicians, called up the union and said, could I have, whatever number of people he was asking for. And when they got there was no music. And he said, you guys just play and I'll sort of point to you and so forth. And I talked to Bill Crow, who was in on that session, bass player, and he said the attitude of the musicians was, this cheapskate is trying to make us do his compositions, which I guess he was.
That's great. Um,
Stefan Volpe, got it. It was he.
okay, great. Yeah. Another field that Smith was one of the most influential figures in. I had no idea about any of this before reading your book. Was avant-garde film. Jonas Mekas was a big fan. You've already mentioned that, but could you give us a sense of what his impact was in that field, and some of the people that he was associating with in the world of film?
Yeah, Harry had been interested in manipulating images pretty early in life. His parents had worked in Alaska at different times, and they had apparently hundreds of pictures. But more than that, they had a lot of them weren't printed out, and they were just the negatives. And Harry was holding them up to the light and doing things with them and playing around with them, turning them backward and forward. And it's not clear what he did altogether. The one person who knew him when he was young said that he was doing some kind of animation, but since he wasn't this person wasn't interested in that, he never discussed it with him. But Harry was playing around with cigar boxes and running little strips of film through things and so forth, maybe with lights underneath. So when he got to Berkeley, there's an interesting thing going on there. The San Francisco Museum of Art, as it was called at the time, um, was recognizing jazz as an art and pushing it, just as the Museum of Modern Art was doing at the same moment. They were the only places doing that. But both of them were also pushing film as an art. Now, that sounds a little strange, except there was actual resistance to this, to the idea of film, partly because, and you have to acknowledge this is serious, it's hard to show in a museum. It's still hard to show. You have to set a whole part of the museum apart, which they did at San Francisco, or you've got to sort of put a little black box somewhere and just crowd people in there and they take turns listening to it. Plus the fact it's not like you can't just sort of look at it like a painting. It's moving, so you could easily be sitting in there for an hour, and this changes the whole pattern of things. It's also an economic matter, which is since film can be bought cheaply in copies, you can't get rich people to give you a film and say, here, you can do what you want to with it, and then you can't finance it, and you can't, if in other words, it was too cheap in some ways.
Right.
So
it doesn't have that aura of unreproducibility, right?
Right, and although they should have been aware of the fact that some of the earliest people who were animating basically were trying to animate painting, or certainly Harry was. He painted directly onto film, which he's not the first to do. That was done by uh, by several other people. And he was shocked to find out not only that he wasn't the first, but that they had done it on 16 millimeter and he'd done it on 35. So his work was much easier to do in theory. However, Harry's was much more detailed and interesting than the other people working. What he would do, he'd had to paint both sides of the film, the background and the front. And he worked out techniques by putting little pieces of paper or sticky dots on, and then pulling them off after it dried, so you could get different colors and shapes doing things, and then you'd have to move them as you did this. It's very slow work, and you could spend a year on a 1 minute film if you're not, because you're having to do some of the frames the same every time to make it visible. Otherwise, it just flies past. So Harry started that way, and he was trying to represent the same things he'd seen with Dizzy Gillespie, exploding dots and triangles and things flying through the air. And it's worth remembering that animation began exactly at the same time as motion pictures did, and it was far more advanced in that they could do things that the others couldn't do. You could make people appear from nowhere, fly. My favorite was in one earlier film in which an animated character disappears, and then when the credits are rolling, sticks his head back in to make sure he's got credits. You could, in fact, they did more things than anyone else would dare to do, like smoking the film, changing its color that way, and so on. So you got to see that it is a kind of really advanced technique right from the beginning. Now, Harry stumbles into that the hard way because he hasn't got a camera and he hasn't got the money to either have it developed or pay for the rights to the music. So what he ended up doing was having to perform the film, which is to say, match the speed with the music and what have you, and led him to the idea that maybe anything would go with anything, which he was always saying. And it's remarkably true, although when it's not true, it's not. A good example, if you watch the stuff up on YouTube, some of it has just been taken off of commercial issues, but that was the period when Harry tried out the Beatles as a soundtrack. And what happens is that the Beatles are still singing while the film ends, or vice versa. And the stuff is kind of annoying, actually. You're better off not watching it that way. But he was encouraged to do that kind of thing, and he did it. I had the sense that Harry was trying to reinvent film. And by that I meant he went back to the earliest kind of thing, which was pre-film, basically, where you're doing things on strips of cloth or paper and working your way up and spinning images on wheels and the rest of it. And then he started to do things like one film, which doesn't exist anymore, was projected onto, he did a film, projected it on a screen, and behind the screen he had lights that would change in various ways so that if you're standing in front, it's changing without you seeing the device behind it. Then he took a film of the film. So, but viewers, when they saw this at the San Francisco Art Museum, they weren't aware they were watching a film of a film, but it was somehow texturally different. And we don't, someone would have done this since then, but you can imagine that it would be different with these different dimensions of it. Later, he started manipulating film, like a DJ might do, by his use of Mysterioso by Thelonious Monk, which he began just a 3.5-minute film to go with, then said to himself, what if I reverse this? So he ended up having the film run with the record and then run the record and the film backwards and then go back to the other. So it's a 3-part thing, A, B, A, and so forth. So it seemed to me like he was doing that. Then he moved on to other things such as multiple screens and the like. And I think, but always adding something, always doing something different. His use of multiple screens was really different than Abel Gantz's Napoleon or even Andy Warhol's Electric Factory Walls things. They were just, they weren't playing off each other, is what I mean to say. So if you have 4 screens, you could have those 4 appearing in different places. You could have 2, 3. You could put the same thing up. You put nothing up. And it's a totally different way to work. And typical of Harry, it's enormously expensive to run the film, and you would have to do it the hard way, as he did, which was making selections as you on the fly. So when you can see it, and it will be shown at the Whitney in October, it's already in a fixed form, so it's not with Harry's changing. In fact, when it was shown at its premiere, the Anthology Film Archive said every night will be a different film.
So it really was a performance. I mean, it's almost like some kind of a VJ performance or something.
Yeah.
It's not like he just said, okay, now play the film. He was really an active part of each different screening of these films.
Yeah, and it may be forgotten by people who weren't close to this stuff in the 70s, but there was a period where people did outrageous things. They would have cameras but no film in it. And what you'd be watching is someone dancing around the room with a camera, or they would have something that was really not projectionable. In fact, I think Mikas mentions that in one of his voice pieces, where he says, if you're going to, we now have people such as Warhol and Harry, whose films can't be shown without them being there, which is going to raise the cost of them going to festivals and the like. And then he mentions the dancing phenomena and the people tricking people with the cameras and so forth.
Right, yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Anthology of American Folk Music. We've touched on it a bit, but One of the things that was surprising to me in reading your book was that the anthology really was not a big seller at its time of release, and didn't really become one for quite some time. I mean, it's still pretty expensive. You can find
Right.
versions of it online, but if you want to buy the records or even the CDs, it's a costly proposition. It almost reminded me of the kind of chestnut about the Velvet Underground. Not many people bought the album, but everybody that did started a band. It seems like not many people bought the anthology of American folk music, but everyone that did bought an acoustic guitar, maybe. How was its influence felt, and how did it become known as this kind of classic, a kind of Bible for the folk revival, given that it didn't actually sell all that many copies?
Yeah, it was expensive. It's around in today's money around $250. And that was because Moash thought it wasn't commercially viable. He was putting out things that were, we don't think about it now because they're not being reproduced. But he had films on how to type on a typewriter, or you know, anything bizarre. A bunch of kids hanging out on a corner talking. Almost anything was recordable. He would record. And he expected only to be saleable to schools and to libraries who could afford more, and that was his point. Not that it would even pay off what he was doing, but it was not a profit-making enterprise at first. And I think Harry got the equivalent of $1,900 advance by today's standards for doing this. He didn't sell anything for, well, try this. It was never mentioned in print for 10 years. And the first mention was by a British jazz guy who grasped immediately what he was up to. And then the other two were ethnomusicologists who sort of got the idea. Actually, that's wrong. It was only the one, and a library journal reference to it. The one I was thinking of was later when he did the peyote songs from the Kiowa, Kiowa, sorry. One reviewer said that the recordist suggested that you use peyote when you're listening to it, and he said, unfortunately, there was none in the box set. So mixing those two up. But at any rate, yeah, it was just expensive, and it caught on in the village. And I talked to people who were alive at that time, and they said, yeah, it was surprising. The musics that were really popular in the early 70s in the village were things like African music was beginning to be heard a lot, certainly Latin music, bullfight music, exoticism of that form, and it was affecting various arts in various ways. And it mostly was heard on cassettes being passed around. People who couldn't afford these things. I even had them that way. In fact, they're still happening out in one form or another out in Europa, where Harry was for a while. So it was an underground phenomenon, mostly because of economics and because of the overall weirdness of it. Grail Marcus always talks about the old weird America. We're now in the new weird America, so maybe we should have an album now for our own. I guess it is happening. People are making records that seem like they were made for this time period.
Right.
If, I'm drifting off the subject. Sorry.
Right. I mean, but this music. I mean, if you look at the track list on these albums, and if you're at all conversant in folk music, he really does get a lot of the big names of that genre. I mean, Mississippi John Hurt. There's the Carter Family. I'm just looking at it now. Furry Lewis. I mean, he really did a great job of kind of getting a lot of the big names, but also an incredible range of music. I mean, and people who wouldn't have necessarily thought of themselves as folk musicians. I mean, there's gospel, there's Creole music from Louisiana, there's country music, blues music, early jazz. Did Harry Smith in some ways kind of create this idea of folk music as this kind of catch-all term? Can that be credited to some way with the anthology?
He was wary of using it on the record. He finally agreed to that because he thought it would be treated as what? I'm trying to think what he said about it. He was kind of vague, but he thought it was.
Like it would all be Pete Seeger or something
Oh,
like
yeah,
that. Is that the idea?
that's exactly right. Yeah, which, and if you think back, the Weavers and Seeger and Burl Ives were pretty easy listening people. I mean, they had a political edge, but um, Woody Guthrie, quit from several of those projects because he thought they were too mainstream. They were appearing in tuxedos, I mean, whatever, that's
Right.
that's a whole other phenomena. How did folk music cross over among the very wealthy? And I was stunned to find in a file somewhere an invitation to a new hotel in New York on the Upper East Side, and they were having not just real folk musicians; they were having square dance lessons. I'm thinking, my God, the hotel is really expensive. Who are these people? But then, I mean, this is the way of history. When I found a picture on the web of black students at Howard, not only dancing to square dance, but to a white country group, I thought, damn, anything is possible.
Right. These cultural circuits are always wider than we maybe would think that they would be.
Yeah, and we wire them down to our own listening practices, which is tragic. Try telling somebody, try quoting to somebody who's a hardcore jazz fan that let's see, certainly Albert Eiler. Well, Albert Eiler was do for the moment. Musicians who were thought really ultra, they were the far out as you're going to go, saying they were trying to get that old New Orleans sound.
Right.
And it's true. If you look at what they're doing, their marches, their church pieces, and so forth.
Threadgill too. Henry Threadgill strikes me as another example.
Right, and yeah, and it's we who are these are the people with the big picture, and we're the ones with the little picture. It's something. I'm old enough to have gone through lots of phases of different music, and I look back. I don't regret any of them, but I wondered why I spent so much time listening to some bad country music. Some of Bakersfield, California music that was not that interesting. Um, but there's a famous example, not famous at all, but it's mentioned once in a while, that a musician, was dropped by to see Thelonious Monk, and he was playing some bad country music. And the guy said, I think it's Steve Lacy, maybe. He said, "Are you listening to this?" And he said, "Check out the drummer." And Lacy, if it was Lacy, said, "The drummer was interesting."
That's great. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess maybe that leads to a final question, sort of a summing up question, which is how do you reconcile the sort of ultra vanguardist side of Harry Smith with the traditionalist side? I mean, here's this guy who is hand painting experimental animated films and projecting them in a unique way at every performance and hanging out with Jonas Mekas and Maya Deren, but also deeply interested in this kind of backwoods country and folk music from the 20s. I mean, how do you reconcile those two sides of his personality?
Very good question and hard to answer. There are always in every generation, I guess, people who approximate this in some way or another. Off the top of my head, someone like let me think, David Amram, not as extreme as Harry, but a guy who's comfortable and has played with all kinds of groups, folk, classic. Just if you look him up on Wikipedia, you say, can a guy who was writing Hollywood scores for really good films and was the first composer in residence with Leonard Bernstein, and was also recording with American Indians and so forth. Is this the same? And was doing jazz and poetry stuff. Is this the same person? Well, there are always people like that. I ended up talking about the concept of Virginia Woolf's, which was the idea of the eccentric. And I thought when I looked at her two pieces on eccentricity and the arts, I thought we're going to get the usual British view of the crazy Brit, but that's not what she meant. She's going back to the original use of the word, meaning out of the center and on the edge. And she's talking about people who are so on the edge that they can't be successful, that they won't be acknowledged, except by those people who are very cool and on top of things and are saying, "Whoa, what is this here?" And they incorporate it and are affected by it, and they don't necessarily credit their sources. And she says, by the way, she says in passing, that's why we're never going to see a good biography of these people. And I said, whoa, that hurts. But I understood what she was saying. These people are beyond biography. There's no t- clear timeline, no taste line. There's no how do they survive? I mean, and some of the the modern composers of the 40s and 50s were like Harry bums. We haven't talked about that phenomenon, but how do you survive on the streets, or how do you survive riding on the back of trains and things, and living with hobos? The world of art is way, way bigger than we like to remember, I think.
Yeah. You have that wonderful quote. I think it's by Allen Ginsberg when he says, when you disappear in New York, you really disappear. And you kind of get the sense that, Harry Smith was like on the run or something. Like he was like living in these little interstices within New York City in a way that, I mean, you say, in the book, like, how could he have possibly survived with no job and insecure funding in, a, a city like New York? But it kind of seems to me like maybe you could only do that in a city like New York.
That's a good point. I think for my time I lived in New York, I would when I first moved to New York, I don't know, was walking to work and I went past the gospel. No, that was secondary. There was a preacher on a corner in an empty lot, and he was apparently there every day because I saw him every day and had gospel singers behind him. It was pretty good. So I mentioned this to a friend I knew who was native-born New Yorker who was into that kind of music, and I said, "Hey, did you check out the minister over? I forget where it's not 14th Street. It was 18th or 19th something." And he said, "No, but I go by there every day." I said, "You can't be going by there every day." So I went with him. He said, "Gee, I never noticed these people." Well, that's the other side of New York, right? Uh,
Right.
People turn up where you don't expect them, or you don't want them, or whatever, or you don't have time, or um, distractions like crazy. And in fact, what I remember about my time in New York was I kept running into things that had no signs and no announcements, and people were lining up, and I'm thinking, what am I missing here? I wandered
Right.
into one of those things once, and it was a place that had every night two plays being read, you know, by actors that they'd hired the day before to read these parts, and for $5 you could see this play, and I thought, damn, that is incredible. But then I found out some people knew that were going there all the time. They had a fixed audience for it.
Wow. Well, I really love this book for a lot of reasons. I learned more about this person, but it's also just such a wonderful. We didn't really get much time to talk about this, but such a wonderful evocation of that time in New York history. Kind of 50s to the 70s when that incredible bohemian ferment was going on, and Harry Smith was at the center of more than one scene within that world. So it was really a great kind of time capsule of that world. So. Thank you so much for writing this wonderful book, Cosmic Scholar, and thanks for appearing on New Books in Performing Arts to talk about it.
I appreciate being on. Thank you.